Hello, I'm Ronnie Eldridge. Welcome to Eldridge and Company. Jill Vexler is a cultural anthropologist who specializes in curating exhibitions about cultural identity and social history. She's brought her expertise to Barnard College as project manager of the exhibit called Helen Suzman, Fighter for Human Rights. Suzman was a politician and member of South Africa's parliament and my hero and great inspiration. The exhibit describes her work, her family, and South Africa during apartheid. And before we talk about her, I'd like very much to talk to Jill about cultural anthropology. What is a cultural anthropologist?
How many hours do we have?
I should start with anthropologist.
Anthropologist. Basically, we look at learned behavior. We look at learned behavior in groups of people called societies, and we try to extrapolate what norms of behavior, traditions, values, technology, economy, and human relations really center around. So we basically try to extrapolate the structures of behavior.
So do you have an answer to the question I ask all these people, the young people who we've met, who are committed to really trying to change the world? And they come from environments not necessarily filled with people like them. How do they happen to be who they are, and how do other people happen to be other in the same society? Is that a too complicated a question?
Well, I'm not sure whom you've met, so I can't speak for people I haven't met. But if you're talking about a younger generation of people, 20s and 30s,
well, even older generation. Why, for instance, in politics, did I so rarely agree with most of my colleagues?
Because there are many paths within the structures. Because you have a structure of behavior doesn't mean that your values are always the same. And there's always a continuum.
Yeah.
There's always the person who is extremely conservative on something yet liberal on something else. Inconsistency is part of who we are.
Yeah.
So that the challenge of anthropology is not to generalize to the point that you leave people out. And of course, that's extremely difficult. And then for me, as I worked many years ago, in fact began my career working on cultural exhibitions about world cultures for children's museums, when I would speak to boards of directors and somewhat timid staffs, they always said, oh, but what you're doing is stereotyping people. And I said, no, what we're doing is extrapolating to the core to find archetypes of behavior. Stereotypes come from outside, archetypes come from within. And so if you're really into the culture, if you've really done your homework and done your research, then what you've done is so thoroughly researched and accurate and authentic that it will include the spectrum of behavior.
You started doing a lot of work in Mexico?
Mexico,
and
yes.
And you love Mexico?
Love Mexico. Just came back. It's glorious.
And then you worked in South America also.
Many years, yes.
But I loved the exhibit. They tell the story that you really recreated a street in a town.
Oh, we've done that quite a few times. But the very first experience, I think, was taking a dissertation that probably 2 people in the world have ever read other than my doctoral committee. And really turning it.
What was the name of it?
Oh my God. It was called Chachahuantla, which is the name of this little village I lived in. There was a Nahuatl-speaking, Aztec-speaking Indian village northwest of Mexico City, northeast of Mexico City. And my research was on the interrelationship of the social and economic systems around weaving and embroidery.
Oh,
and how that entree into the village was a way to understand who married whom, how inheritance of property worked, and it was
interesting.
Among many doors to interculture is material culture, and since I love textiles and they're beautiful, it was a way for me to begin to learn about an extremely complicated culture with 1,800 people in this village. But what we did at the former Capitol Children's Museum in Washington was we built that village. 7,000 square feet of village. So children who came in entered through Mexico City and ended up living during their 2 or 3 hour visit the life of an indigenous person, from harvest to cooking to weaving to embroidery, child rearing, and all sorts of things. And I have friends who are now in their 30s who remember going to that show, and so it's very gratifying.
I remember taking a grandchild to a museum in Seattle where they had a similar kind of thing of different cultures and just a whole scene in the diorama of whatever. So
that was important in saying, well, what's anthropology for if you're not a professor? And if you're not doing hands-on work and development in some of the lesser developed countries, then to teach American children, and by definition their teachers and caregivers who came with them, about other cultures through these very well-researched hands-on activities was something I thought made sense for our changing society.
And then you've done a couple of them. Well, you did a group of women in a town in Poland. Tell me what that is.
Well, the first exhibition that I became involved in Poland was a portrait of pre-war Jewish life in a little town called Lubomel. Lubomel's now in Ukraine. And my predecessor, Fred Wasserman, had gathered over 2,000 photographs of this village. And then Aaron Ziegelman, the man who was born in the village, who had funded this and wanted really to recapture his boyhood life before 1939, when he and his widowed mother and sister moved to America. So he said, go to Lubomel, see what you can find, let's make a movie. And so I spent almost a week there in this little tiny former shtetl, and I loved it. And everyone said, what are you going to do there for a week? Well, there's weaving and embroidery, there's gardening, there are people who still make bread from scratch with a mill in their backyards. And so it was just it was kind of a frozen...
they had stayed through the whole war.
Yes, I mean the Ukrainians and Poles, but there's barely a trace of Polish culture now and no trace of Jewish culture. It was just as if someone took a gigantic eraser. Absolutely gone.
So your work ends up in a display of some kind, not necessarily a written dissertation, although there'll be a narrative to whatever you're exhibiting?
Right.
Is that a common thing with a cultural anthropologist? Is that part of what that is? Or do they write?
Both. And anthropologists write, they lecture. I think an anthropological approach, which does look at these different doors to enter how people behave, is a very rich framework and gives me a panoply of tools with which to curate exhibitions. Because ultimately, you know too much, you've learned too much, and you'll drown the visitor if you put it all on the walls. So the role of the curator really is to distill all that you've learned and create not only a narrative, a verbal narrative, but a visual narrative.
An image,
So I love working with designers who help me tell the story as clearly as possible.
So to be, I'm trying to place it in my mind with things like understanding Barack Obama. Would that be a subject? Could that whole line of his family become the subject?
I'm dying to do something on his mother.
Yeah.
At the very beginning of his campaign, I happened to hear a speech about foreign policy. It was really early. It has to be at least 3 years ago at this point. And I said, he sounds like an anthropologist. I mean, the man has such extraordinary sensitivity to other points of view while being very American and realizing his goals. He really doesn't have this linear, we're always right attitude, and it infused what he spoke about. And so I called a very close friend of mine in LA who's an anthropologist, and we've been all over rural Mexico, and I said, did you hear that speech? She said, yeah, he sounds like an anthropologist. So we started digging. His mother's an anthropologist.
Oh, isn't that interesting?
No surprise. And one of my very close friends from fieldwork in southern Mexico actually was in graduate school with her at the University of Hawaii. And he was visiting New York last Christmas. And I said, so tell me about Obama's mother. And he said, she's like us. And I said, what do you mean she's like us? And he said, the old school anthropology, when you can sit in a village for months of your life and absorb how other people view the world. She loved everyone. She got along with everyone. She had this marvelous xenophilia, which I think is pretty essential if you want to be an anthropologist. It's not to say you can't criticize and you don't have a critical eye toward what you're experiencing and learning, but you basically have to enter with an openness. Maybe philia is too much, but certainly an openness. And he said she just loved learning about the world, and her research in Indonesia was stupendous, as well as with some of the traditions of Hawaii. So I think that those biographic narratives are extremely difficult, but as we see with the Helen Suzman story, you can do a great deal with essentially photojournalism.
It's so interesting. So let's talk about Helen Suzman. She was a remarkable woman.
Every day I'm reminded more and more how remarkable she was.
Somehow, when I was younger, and she's older than she's now died a couple of years ago.
She died a year ago, January.
So she would be 96 now.
She'd be 92 now.
92.
She died at 91.
Right. Mm-hmm. So I think I heard of her when I was involved in politics as a volunteer, but always loved it and always loved that role of, and she answers a question, and I think in a speech that Obama gave yesterday about the health plan when he said that too many of the legislators are concerned about their future and not about what they're doing. Right. And that's the thing that she always did. She had her principles and she stuck to them at whatever cost it was to her.
Right, and I think it's fascinating that her other members of her party, of the Progressive Party, who stuck to theirs, lost their campaigns.
Yeah.
So one of the ironies in her whole trajectory is that while she represented Houghton, which is a relatively wealthy suburb where people
of Johannesburg.
Johannesburg, yes, thank you. Were concerned about changing the system.
Right.
I mean, you might know in your gut that apartheid was wrong, but if it weren't there, what would happen to us? And all these very human responses, critical or not, they're very human responses, or prejudice or not, I should say. But she won. Even her father said, I don't agree with everything you're saying, but run.
Yeah.
You should run, and run again.
And she won each time
she won each time. So she was in Parliament for 36 years, 13 of which she was the only member of her party. So there she was, not only the only member of her party, there were a few...
the only member of her party elected to the Parliament.
Correct.
Right? Yeah.
And there were other anti-apartheid members. She wasn't, but she was the only woman each time speaking up, speaking up, speaking up. And it's not as if she started out with an agenda. She knew that the race relations were going to lead to an explosion. She knew it. And so she got into the system to try to change it. She didn't start out as a prison activist, but in the course of it, she became a prison activist. She didn't start out as an education activist, health rights, go through the whole list of things we're talking about every day in the present administration. But she became an activist on behalf of those people who didn't have access.
She was a natural believer, though. I mean, it wasn't only that there was going to be a confrontation and it was going to be terrible, but she believed, didn't she, that in a sense, she had a sense of justice. I mean, she believed that people
could change,
and that they were equal. And they
yes.
should be equal.
Well, there's actually a marvelous statement at the opening. She was given countless honorary doctorates, and her daughters told me that when they were cleaning out her home, which was filled with treasures, what do you do with 36 caps and gowns? But nevertheless, when she received an honorary doctorate from the University of Cape Town in 1986, she said, and it's the opening text of the curatorial, essentially the curatorial statement of the exhibition, I'm proud to acknowledge that I am a liberal who adheres to old-fashioned liberal values like the rule of law, universal franchise, free elections, a free press, free association, guaranteed civil rights, and an independent judiciary. And that
was it.
That's it.
That's simple
and everything
and that's
is
straightforward,
a
right?
variation on a theme of that.
Now, her family came from Poland.
Lithuania.
And they what was interesting was they went from Lithuania to London down to South Africa.
Yes. Well, that was pretty much the trajectory.
The way they did it.
And the vast majority of the Jewish community of South Africa is Lithuanian and Latvian.
That's interesting. Right. So then she grew up in South America.
Yeah, South Africa.
South Africa.
Yeah, she was born there.
Yeah. Oh, she was born there.
She was born
right.
there.
And then they worked their way up in the economic ladder.
Yes, I mean, just sheer seat of their pants, her uncle and her father just started trading cattle, and cattle grew into meat provisions, and they ended up having one of the largest meat distributors of Johannesburg.
Yeah. And then she must have married while she was in school.
Well, actually, she dropped out.
She dropped
out of college. And as she described it, I had the great honor of spending several hours with her. And she said, I just wasn't ready for college.
She was very young.
I was young, I wasn't serious, and I loved riding horses, and I loved kind of the dashing life, and fell in love with this fabulous young man, much older than I, and everyone criticized me. And he was one of the leading physicians, and became, as friends of mine who are South African physicians in Texas, where I'm from, said, if you studied with Helen Suzman, you studied with the best in the country. It was as if you were with DeBakey in Houston or something.
And he was very supportive.
Very supportive,
So,
very
which
supportive.
is such an important thing for women who are doing
And her
this kind of
daughters
thing.
were two
Yeah.
daughters.
So she had 2 daughters.
Yes.
And then she was involved in politics. And
Well, she was
teaching.
in-
Was she teaching it?
Well, she began to teach, yes. She began to teach economics when she was in her mid-30s, late 30s. And it was through her more in-depth study of the inequities in economics. She had already been doing studies of the racial inequities that she just said, we have to change this structure. And so with a lot of counsel and a lot of, I would say, that kind of Janus face support from her father, who mattered a great deal to her,
Yeah.
she ran.
She, there's a note, or is about that she wrote a note for a man who worked in the house because there was a curfew for people of color.
Yes.
And did they separate it, people of color and blacks?
Yes.
Yeah. Saying that he had permission to come home later or something. How old was she? She was
She
like
was 12,
12.
and she tells that story
Yeah.
to the narrators of the exhibition that just showed, I mean, who was a 12-year-old girl just because she was white to have the privilege of telling an adult man that he could leave, and that was part of her consciousness raising, that the pass laws, you had to have a pass to go different places, were just totally unfair.
And the country was in a terrible state. I mean, they were exporting, they were moving people out, right? People of black people or people of color out of the cities.
Both. They were creating these Bantustans, these settlements in which people of color or blacks, or depending on the different tribal affiliations, tribal linguistic affiliations, were set up for failure, essentially. And in one of her very, very moving speeches, which is highlighted kind of in the crescendo in the middle of the show, she basically says, how can we prosper when we have inferior education, which will only lead people to inferior jobs? And then she multiplies it for women's issues, children's issues, and the whole question of cultural self-esteem.
She had some wonderful comebacks, too, because she was constantly being criticized, right?
Right.
I don't know where they are, but they were really pretty good. But her party was a minority. She joined the the equivalent of a liberal party.
Right, called the Progressive.
Right.
It had many name changes.
Right.
But
All the parties, they changed over and over, and they made different coalitions, and different people joined or moved around.
Right.
So by the time the Progressive Party came, that was when she was alone in the
yes,
parliament.
and then after
later
the 13th,
they mixed.
more were
Yeah.
elected.
So where do you think, what made her who she was? And is that a question for a cultural anthropologist?
It's the intersection of her own biographer, a psychologist, and of course family who watched her. I'm beginning to think that there is something in innate construct of who you are. Your family culture feeds it, your global culture feeds it, the world events, and of course individual experiences feed it. But I think her fiercely independent streak, knowing that to survive as an immigrant you had to work hard, knowing that to be the good Jewish student at the Catholic school she had to study extra, knowing that it was really up to her. She didn't have a mother. Her mother died soon after her childbirth, soon after she was born. And her father, many years later, several years later, married a woman, Debbie, who became very close, and a mother, no question, a mother. But I think there must have been something in that essential sense of self that gave her the self-confidence to stand up for what she knew was right. And it's very interesting because from a Jewish perspective, one would say, oh, she embodies Jewish values of liberal thinking and egalitarianism, and that we're all worthy, regardless of color, sexual orientation, religion, and so forth. We're all worthy individuals, and not to mention in a liberal democratic society. But when asked pointedly about the influence of Jewish values on her political values and her social values, she said, no, actually, it's not that per se, and it's certainly not a philosophical trajectory, but rather a historic commonality of two oppressed people, black people and Jewish people. And that seeing the benefits of overcoming oppression, how could I not want the same for someone else?
Yes.
So it's a variation on a linear trajectory of Jewish values on her, but
It's
the
got
result
some other
is
things.
yeah, and the otherness is that she spread it across the panoply of South Africa, and realized that a country she loved, and she loved dearly until the dying. I mean, she could have moved many times. Mosey could have been a professor all over the United States, all over England, and they didn't move because they really loved South Africa. And she didn't want to go, and she said, so how can I live here in good conscience? We must change it. And she talks very, very movingly about this in her autobiography, knowing that someone would knock me down, I get up again, knock me down, and it's only reflective of them. And I think she had a very strong psychological look. So when people would say to her, the Speaker of the Parliament would say to her, go back to Israel. She said, what's Israel? Go back to Lithuania. I'm not Israeli.
I'm
South African. We're all South African. Let's help our country. And then the same individual would say to her something like, how can you speak to the world? How dare you speak to the international press?
You're giving South Africa a bad name. You're ruining our reputation or some such thing, right?
To which she retorted, no, I believe it's what you're doing.
You're right.
Giving
I
us a bad
loved
name.
that. Was wonderful.
Yeah. So I just think there is something that gives people direction. And she was the first to say she didn't have it at the beginning. But to watch the germination and to watch how it grew, as I said, it wasn't an agenda, but it grew into all of these things which needed to be addressed. And she continued to work on it even after retirement.
And the remarkable thing about her is, as you said, is the breadth of her, where she took all her beliefs. It covered everybody, right? That was very interesting. I mean, I'm thinking now of what makes a great leader,
right?
And where does the resiliency in some people come from, and other people in the same family or living next door don't have it? It's a magical thing, isn't it?
Well, you certainly feel that way when you're around those people who have it.
Yeah.
And so then the point is, what do they spark in you? And what will that do the next time you are confronted? Will you speak up?
Right.
And
that's
so,
an interesting way.
That's
a great way of thinking. I always think, where did they come from? And more of thinking about them instead of thinking now, will that person have an influence on others? That's very good.
But I think that's kind of the point. Well, why go through all of this research? Why make this thing called an exhibition, a catalog, a biography, if in fact you can't distill one little thing that means something to you? If I were an art curator and you came up to me and said, there's that one piece that I loved, it caught my eye, I'd be happy. It doesn't have to be a catalog raisonné of every scribble Picasso did from when he was 4 to 96. That one piece spoke to you. Well, if one piece of Helen's social activism, philosophy, life view sticks with you, then we've done our job.
And what a remarkable place for it to be exhibited, other than a women's college.
Well, this is a whole story too, and in the course of approaching Barnard, which our funder Carol Tolan did, the provost realized that Helen had been a guest lecturer there in the 80s, and so it was all the more wonderful to have it there in their brand new building. And of course, across the street at Columbia, she got an honorary doctorate, so it kind of makes sense.
So the exhibit is on for a couple more weeks at
until
Barnard.
March 28th.
And then it's
Barnard.
traveling?
Yes, I'm absolutely thrilled. I've been involved with traveling exhibitions for many years, and I think I'm as excited about the hosts for this show as I've been about anything I've ever done, because so far the exhibition has already been at 3 traditionally black, historically black colleges and universities, one in San Antonio, one in Houston, Texas Southern University, which did extraordinary programming about extreme prejudice and racism in a collaboration with the Houston Holocaust Museum. Marvelous programming.
Well, we didn't talk about the Holocaust exhibit.
And then it went to Dillard College in New Orleans, which is back on its feet after Katrina. And after Barnard, it goes to Oklahoma. It will be in 2 historically black colleges. And then, to my utter thrill, it's going to Memphis to the National Civil Rights Museum.
Oh, how wonderful.
And that sort of trajectory of, and Morehouse College in Atlanta.
Yeah,
So,
that's great.
And it was actually Helen's nephew in Atlanta who said, let's do it at Morehouse. And I said, well, I had tried, I hadn't succeeded. He said, the Martin Luther King Chapel.
Oh, very good.
And that's where it's going to be.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
And I hope that she does inspire many people and
I hope
touches
so.
lives. And thank you very much for coming. We've come to the end of our half hour.
Oh, thank
and we
you.
Still have so much to talk about, so maybe you'll come back again.
I'd love to.
Thank you
Thank
very
you
much,
so
Jill
much.
Vexler.
Thank you.
So- If there are any people you'd like to hear and topics you'd like us to explore, please let me know. You can write to me at CUNY TV, 365 Fifth Avenue, New York, New York, 10016, or you can go to the website at cuny.tv and click on Contact Us. I look forward to hearing from you.